I see it's hitting 6:03, and the benefit of the web format, right, is that we are recording already. And so this video will be watched by many folks, and let's go ahead and proceed with our
Great.
conversation, the three of us, and hopefully we'll have other folks join us, because this is a really wonderful opportunity to hear from you, Mia, about what life is like working in state government. So let me go ahead and welcome us all to our session today. My name is Amanda Graham. I am the academic director of the Irving Institute for Energy and Society. And Sparks is one of our career-oriented programs. The purpose of Sparks is to foster connections among our alumni and our professionals in the fields of energy and climate, to connect those folks with our students who are considering energy careers and climate careers, and who really want to make an impact in that space. And we really do try to have a breadth of folks represented in our Sparks series, from industry, from government, from nonprofit, from academia, because wherever it is that you go, there is so much to do in the energy and climate space. And we want to illuminate that wide array of pathways for our students. And so what our plan is for our Sparks programming is that our speakers share their personal career paths, and they share advice for people who are looking to join their industry or their sector, and then provide insights into what energy careers are looking like in that space during this really challenging moment in the sort of flux that we see ourselves in energy transitions towards a more sustainable and just climate future. And so with the sharing of those experiences from our alumni and our professional networks, and sharing the challenges that you faced, how you overcame them, what you did that you thought was great on your pathway, what you would try to avoid if you had it to do over again, that guidance is it's worth its weight in gold to our students as they're seeking to navigate their in energy. And so I am delighted to introduce Mia. Milla Anderson is a policy advisor for Congresswoman Annie Kuster. And Mia's portfolio includes energy, commerce, and telecommunications. So she advises the Congresswoman in support of Annie Kuster's work on the Energy and Commerce Committee. Previously, she worked in the Senate for Senator Debbie Stabenow in Michigan on issues in front of the Environment and Public Works Committee. And previous to that, she graduated from Dartmouth College in 2019 with a degree in quantitative social science and a minor in environmental studies. Mia, that's my brief introduction for you. Anything to add briefly before we just ask you to go ahead and illuminate for us your path through Dartmouth and out of Dartmouth, and sort of how you got to where you are today?
Great. No, Amanda, I think you hit all of the major highlights there.
Okay, super.
But I'm happy to start from the beginning and my time when I was actually a student at Dartmouth. My freshman year, I think one of my first classes was environmental law, which was absolutely fascinating. I think I had always thought I would be a government major. And I think I took a very low level government course that year, and it was half as fascinating as the environmental law course. And I think that really sparked my interest pretty early on when you're talking about the legislation that helps influence the way we interact with our environments, and even internationally when you're talking about the Endangered Species Act, or talking about the climate accords. It was fascinating to me. I think also coming from Los Angeles and seeing some of the environmental justices in my own community, and seeing the drought that California had been experiencing for a number of years, I think there was already maybe some seed planted in me from very early on. And I think that environmental law class really helped me see a further path working in the energy and environment space. So I immediately, declared as an environmental studies major, and spent probably most of my freshman and sophomore year taking environmental studies classes. And they're fascinating. I remember sitting in Professor Friedland's lecture halls and listening to his courses. And I really, really found myself interested in the way we govern around our environment, the way we talk about energy policy and regulations that make it easier to deploy clean energy. And And then as you start to get into the major, you also start to take, some of the chemistry classes, or you start talking about like, the atoms and the chemical components. And I realized that the very technical science aspects of it weren't where my passion lies. It was more so, and I guess somewhat of a sociology space, which was why I transitioned majors. I think like most Dartmouth students, I probably went through like 3 majors before I finally found one that stuck. So if anyone's still going through that process, you're not alone. And I'll say I started to look more at like environmental injustices and like the societal impact of the way we had interacted with our environment, and eventually became a QSS major because I found it's a lot more fascinating to try and quantify those interactions and to, develop your own research. And I think that's what the major is really great at. But I kept my environmental studies minor. I think that's where my first passion lied. And that was definitely where I wanted my career to go. And so while I was a junior at Dartmouth during that summer, I had applied to work as an intern on Capitol Hill in DC. I knew I had always wanted to work in policy. I always was fascinated by Congress. I think this is where decisions are really made. And, I think students now are so much more politically engaged than even I was when I was on campus, or I think my class years were. And I think social media has done a great job of letting people get involved in these issues much sooner. And I did my internship through this program called College to Congress, which is a full scholarship that helps students come to Capitol Hill and afford to do the internships. And I think that was a really enlightening experience to see how policy is made, like how you start to have conversations with stakeholders, how you work across the aisle and actually get things passed. And I knew this was the place that I wanted to be. And I wasn't positive it was going to be on Capitol Hill, but it was definitely going to be in the policy space. So after I graduated, I moved to DC. I did not have a job lined up yet. So again, for any students who are approaching the end of their senior year and are worried about having a job and everything figured out, I certainly did not. And so I applied for about a month or so and then got a job in Senator Doug Jones' office from Alabama, and worked there, and worked my way up through like to finally get a legislative portfolio. And after he left Congress in 2020, I joined Senator Stabenow's team from Michigan and actually got to be a leg aide, working on her environment portfolio. And was fascinating to see how different the environmental and energy needs were for, Michigan versus Alabama versus like New Hampshire, which I had spent a lot of time in at that point. And got to work really closely on some major pieces of legislation. This is when the IIJA, like the major infrastructure package, was being passed. And so you're talking about how do we deploy electric vehicle chargers on a large scale nationwide? Like if we are serious about the transition to clean energy, we need to make sure that this is affordable. We need to make sure that the infrastructure is there. And that includes like giving incentives to companies to actually start manufacturing solar panels. Like these jobs and these companies need to be built from the grounds up, and people need to be trained to do them. And so when you're talking about clean energy policy, you're not just talking about energy, you're talking about workforce development, you're talking about infrastructure development. And so starting to understand the intersections of that, I think, has been super helpful in my career. And after a year in Senator Stabenow's office, I joined Representative Kuster's office, and she's also a Dartmouth alum, and her district represents Dartmouth as well, which is great. And so I worked really closely with her on energy policy, and you'll find that each member approaches things very differently and has, different ideas of the best pathway or what priorities they want to pursue. Like no member can be an expert on everything. And Congressman Kuster has been great at pushing hydropower as a solution towards clean energy. And that's one that's definitely been overlooked and was one that wasn't talked about very frequently in some of my other offices. We talk a lot about electric vehicles, we talk a lot about solar power and wind generation. But I think if we're actually going to get to like a clean energy revolution, we really need to look at all the tools in our toolbox and deploy them. And so that's what I've been working on in her office. And it's given me the opportunity to also work on many other policy issues, which I think is pretty fascinating. And if you're a student and used to, taking classes and multiple different issues and then jumping to the next topic, it feels like a lot like that, like you're constantly learning about something new.
Yeah.
That's a great intro, Mia. Thank you so much for that. Can you just because you sort of opened the door to this. What's your favorite project that you're working on right now, or that or your the initiative or issue that you're most excited about is sort of on topic in Representative Kuster's office?
Yeah, I'll say one that has been really precedent of this last week is I'm working on legislation to um, reauthorize the National Dam Safety Program. And we don't necessarily think about dams as often when we're thinking about our environment or when we're thinking about energy. We don't really think about hydropower. But every state has dams, and you might not notice them, but there's one that you pass like driving up to campus quite often.
The Wilder Dam.
Um,
Yep.
Exactly. And it was very fascinating actually going back to visit the Wilder Dam as a policy staffer, having just driven past it, tens of hundreds of times probably as a student in my 4 years there. Um, and so I think when we talk about dam safety, we talk about like reinvesting in our nation's infrastructure, and dams are some of our oldest infrastructure. Hydropower is some of our oldest forms of power. And you think back to like mills and wheels spinning through rivers to actually power them. Um, I find this incredibly interesting because it's been overlooked for so long.
Yeah.
And so when we talk about policy, it's not just, you introduce the bill and then it gets a vote on the floor and then it's a yes or no, it passes. Once you introduce legislation, before you even introduce legislation, you're working to build stakeholder support. So you need to figure out what stakeholders care about dam safety. And that's reaching out to the state dam safety official and asking what they need to make their jobs more effective, because dam safety is community safety. If one of those dams fails or is breached, the communities nearby are also impacted. And so, you talk to your dam safety officials, but then you're also going to talk to the communities that may support having the dam in their neighborhood, or getting benefits like recreational benefits from them, like being able to kayak on the river because the waters are controlled and calm. So those recreational opportunities also play a big impact. And then in some states, you're also really working with tribal groups, because dams have definitely had impacts on the way that they interact with the environment. And I think as stewards of the environment, they are also incredible resources when we're talking about this. And you need to work to get all the stakeholders on the same page and figure out where there's some kind of consensus. And that's what you can build legislation on. When everyone's pointing to the exact same problem, they might not all have the exact same solution to fix it, but trying to get everyone on the same page. And maybe, the problem's very large and you can narrow it to one key point that you can fix through legislation. And once you figure that out, it's finding the right offices who care about those same priorities, because they might be hearing about it in their district as well. Or the boss, that Congress member may have worked in dam safety in the past, and so has some kind of relationship and like understands those issues. So once you find those, and you actually get to introduce the bill, and that's the point that we're at. We've introduced our National Dam Safety Reauthorization Act, and now it's trying to get it passed. And sometimes you can get a bill to the floor and get a vote on it, but first it has to go to a committee. And the committee has to mark up that bill and see if they should do any changes or amendments. And then it has to go to the full committee to actually get passed. And then there's a chance that it can get on the floor. So if anyone's ever watched the I'm Just a Bill cartoon, like that only gave you the top lines of how legislation moves. One thing that we're working on is we're working very closely with committee, both the Democratic side and the Republican side, to make sure that they both agree and don't have problems with our bill. And then at that point, we try and find legislative packages for it to move on, because most bills don't get passed just with one vote by themselves. Because once they pass the House, they also have to pass the Senate, and that's a whole nother hurdle. But like we're working to get this into like a major reauthorization bill, because there's like the Water Resources Development Act, which gets reauthorized like every 2 years. We're working to put it into that bill, or we can potentially get it into our annual government like appropriations bill, which is currently being debated. And so there is a lot of talking and negotiating to actually get a bill passed at the end of the day.
That was a brilliant short version of what it takes. I was going to ask, when you said, that you've been working on drafting legislation, I was going to ask sort of, what does it mean to be in that drafting process? And what you sort of expanded on is it's not just, a piece of writing, right? It's all of the listening and learning and relationship building before, during, and after that process. And
Yeah.
so two follow-up questions on that. One, could you say a little bit more about how you personally have been involved with the different parts of that process as a policy advisor to the representative? And could you also shed a little bit of light on what parts of your Dartmouth career helped best to prepare you for those functions that you're serving in that process right now?
Yeah, and I'll say, today I had a meeting with some of our stakeholders who have helped us really draft the bill. 'Cause some of these ideas aren't going, like, I have no experience in dams. I clearly passed by the Wilder Dam and never thought twice about it while I was a student. And so you have a lot of meetings with different stakeholders who are going to come to your congressional office and say, like, we really care about this issue. We would like the Congresswoman to act in these ways to help support this issue. Um, and so sometimes they'll bring legislative ideas to you. And this was one that was brought to our office. And so, the first step is like taking these meetings and being willing to have conversations on a variety of issues and also being willing to learn about them. Like I had no background here, so I had to learn about the history. I had to learn what members may have worked on this in the past. You don't want to steal a bill from a member. You want to make sure that your member is the right one to work and lead a priority. And I think because of Annie's history working on hydropower, it made a lot of sense for her to work on this legislation and to be a lead for it, and like the leading voice, I think, in Congress, at least on the Democratic side. And so you have those meetings and you work with them to draft legislation. And so you might get their support drafting legislation. Like, I'm not a lawyer. I don't actually write the legislation. I analyze it and I evaluate it and I make a recommendation to the Congress member about it. And so you have those meetings. And once you actually decide to lead or have your member lead on the bill, then you're going back and forth with stakeholders. So today we had like a strategy conversation where it's like, okay, we know the bill stuck for some reason in committee. It was the stakeholders, myself, and then also the Republican lead staffer on this. And so I was like, okay, I'll go talk to minority subcommittee and make sure that they don't have any concerns. And if they do, then let's figure out how to alleviate them. Like, do we need to change certain words in the bill? Do we need to add certain exceptions? And the Republican will work to do the same thing. And so I will say one thing that Dartmouth did really well to help me prepare for this is I think professors did a great job of encouraging conversation and encouraging debate in classes in ways that was very thought-provoking without, I think, being overbearing on issues that can be touchy or can be controversial. I spend a lot of my time working with people across the aisle, and just because we work for different political parties doesn't mean that we can't come to some consensus on specific issues. Like, dam safety shouldn't have a political party. And maybe we might disagree on how to execute dam safety, but we can agree that it's a priority, and then we can start to figure out where we have common ground. And that's where I think the best legislation comes from.
I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm actually, because we have such a lovely intimate group, I'm going to open it up for conversation and questions from Hatley, Carly, and Nina as well, so that we can make sure that we really dig into the reasons that you all are here this evening. Actually, two questions. Forgive me. I would love to hear you reflect on both how you would characterize working as a legislative aide or policy advisor in the state, because you've worked mostly in the state government, in that context as a sort of as a place to work, as a way to work, right? How in what ways do you recommend that to your friends or not to your friends, right? And so give us a sense for sort of what that work culture is like and what that work experience sort of day to day is like. And then the other question I wanted to hear from you was, what are your aspirations? Like, what might you hope for yourself for the next 5 years, right? Wherever you want to be 5 years from now. And how is where you are now a stepping stone? And then Hatley, Carly, Nina, then we'll open it up for questions from you all as well to learn more from you.
Yeah, no, I'll start with the first one. I think some of the best advice I got when I was interning, actually, and starting to think about what my next steps after college would be. And I knew I wanted to work in the federal government. I knew I wanted to work on policy. Trying to figure out what space to work on policy is a whole nother conundrum. I mean, there's think tanks that you can work for, and those tend to be very research based. So like you are basically doing a research project like you would for college, and you are deep in the weeds, and maybe you're running analysis yourself, and you're working with like experts who probably have PhDs on those issues, and work solely on those issues. And I thought that might be an interesting career path. There's also, different levels of the government, whether that's federal, state, or local. And one thing someone told me is figure out what you want your leverage point to be, figure out what your skills are and where they are best applied, and also what makes you happy, like what you enjoy doing. I realized that I didn't actually love doing a lot of the research projects that I did in college. Like I knew I wanted to be in the decision-making process, but I didn't want to be in the weeds necessarily. And so that sort of ruled out think tanks for me. And then when you look at, government level, figure out how close you want to be to the issue. What I have noticed is that I don't get to work on the ground on any of these issues on a day-to-day basis. I get to meet with stakeholders who do, and I get to learn from them and try and make, recommendations to the congresswoman from, the concerns that they've brought up or the legislation that they support or have concerns about. But I don't actually work with the people who are impacted by these issues on a day-to-day basis. Like I don't work in the communities that have dams or with the dam owners themselves. And for some people, having those interactions with the people who are most involved on the issue is where they want to be. I work at like a 300 or 3,000 foot level, quite honestly. I say if you work for state governments, you are going to be much closer, more involved. If you work for the state of New Hampshire, you would specifically be working on New Hampshire issues. Whereas, working for a federal member, like for the federal government, for a Congress member, yes, I'm focused on New Hampshire, but I'm also looking at policies that are going to have a national impact. Like National Dam Safety Reauthorization says it in the name. Like this is not just to, provide support to New Hampshire dams, it's to do it for national dams. And I think that's what you need to figure out what you want to work on. Like, do you want to work specifically on one issue area and do the research? Maybe look at a think tank. Do you want to be super involved in like your local community and make sure that you're revitalizing it and like maybe bringing funding back to it, or working to help local communities figure out how to install solar and get funding for that? Work on the local level or work for a company that's actually doing that work in those communities. If you want to work specifically for New Hampshire, like start to look at New Hampshire DOE or some of the other like government agencies in that space. But if you want to work on policy that, may have more of a national impact, but also a less immediate impact, like federal legislation takes a very long time to pass, like 2 years sometimes for certain pieces. So you will have to delay some of the gratification of the work that you're doing. Whereas you might get that a lot more often if you work on a more like small scale impact. And so I think balancing the skills that you have, the impact that you want to make, and like where you want to leverage those is really important.
That's great. How about my question about where you want to be in 5 years from now?
That's the hardest question for me. I think if someone asked me when I was in college where I wanted to be, I don't 100% know if I would have been. I would have immediately said I'm going to be on Capitol Hill. And I will say part of the reason why it's difficult, I think, sometimes to project where you'll be in 5 years is because Congress, changes over every 2 to 4 years. When I first started in Doug Jones's office, I didn't realize that, he wasn't going to win his reelection. And so then you wonder, like, what's next? Do I move to another office? And I eventually did, but I wouldn't have been able to predict that, I think, in advance. I will say where my passions lie has definitely been in the policy space. I don't see myself leaving the policy space. Everyone's always asked, like, when are you going to get, are you planning to get, another degree? And I think when I first left college, I had said, I'm going to get a master's degree. I'll probably work for a year or two, get past the burnout and then come back and go and get maybe a master's. And then I think the more I worked in this space, the more I realized that getting a master's isn't necessary in a lot of offices or in a lot of policy portfolios to get to the next level. And what someone told me is that working on Capitol Hill is the best master's of public policy that you can get. Nothing is more applicable than the work that you're actually doing and what you're learning here. So I don't know if another degree is in my future. I do know that policy is definitely in my future. And I think the experience that you get working in Congress is so invaluable. I think opportunities after that are probably like moving up in a congressional office or would be leaving to work with like stakeholders and helping to lobby Congress. And I will say that lobbying gets a bad name everywhere, but as someone who works very closely with lobbyists quite often, they end up being the experts in a lot of these issues. A lot of them have experience on Capitol Hill and so are great at letting you understand the nuances and the history behind an issue, whether that be the policy or the politics behind it, because there are very distinct differences in those. Um, and I'll say that the main priority for me is to make sure that you understand where people's biases are. Like, you may agree with certain stakeholders on some issues, but you have to remember that they have different priorities than what the congresswoman might have. But that doesn't mean that we're not going to agree sometimes, and figuring out when those distinctions are, I think, is really important.
Super. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Hatley, Carly, Nina, what questions do you have for Mia? And perhaps when you start, if you could introduce yourself, sort of why you're here, what year you are at Dartmouth, what your major is, that sort of thing, that would help us get the conversation going.
No pressure.
I can go first. So my name's Hatley. I am an environmental studies and history double major. I am in my final term at Dartmouth, so I'm a 23 plus 1 is how the COVID numbering has worked out. So took an extra term off during COVID, and so I'll be done in November. And I guess one thing that I'm wondering is, how did you kind of move between offices? And how was that process, since you talked about like not knowing how that was going to work, and just like any insight you could give into that would be interesting.
Yeah. So I will say I think Congress and Capitol Hill can be a black box. It's really difficult to understand how to navigate it until you're there. I think internships are the best way to like launch a career on Capitol Hill and give you a lot of really important insight, but just for organizational purposes. So every member of Congress typically has a DC and a district-based team. The DC staff is typically more legislative focused, and the district staff is typically more focused on like constituent-facing services. The top of an office will definitely be like your chief of staff, and they help coordinate both the DC and the district office, and oftentimes are also very involved on the campaign side of an office. And then underneath that, on the DC side, you'll have your legislative director. So they manage the entire legislative portfolio. And then you'll typically have like legislative assistants who are leads on specific parts, on specific portfolios. So, I was a legislative assistant, now changed to promoted to like a policy advisor. But a lot of my roles are still the same. So there are certain portfolios that I cover, and that's energy, that's telecommunications and technology, that's, infrastructure. Senate offices tend to be a little bit more focused because they have larger staff. So you'll just have a legislative like health LA, or you'll just have like a banking LA, but they won't do too many cross jurisdictional issues. So in Senate and House office, you'll likely also have a legislative correspondent who will handle some legislative portfolios. But also when, people say write into your member of Congress, we get all of those messages, we get all those phone calls, we get all that mail. So your legislative correspondent is also really responsible for managing the mail program and sending responses to constituents and their concerns. You'll also have like a scheduler in each office, and they help make sure that the Congress member is where they're supposed to be at the right time, like manage all their meetings. No office could run without a scheduler. And then you have your staff assistant who manages the front office. You typically manages the intern program, manages a lot of the phone calls and coordinates that. And then you also have like your press team who work mostly on communications, but interact a lot with the ledge team to get a better understanding of like how we want to talk about policy and put that in a more public facing space. So I give you that background to say that I started as an intern, and then when I came to Capitol Hill, I started as a staff assistant. So I wasn't even working on policy for my first year in Congress, which can be disheartening when you graduate and you're super passionate and like want to work on an issue right away. but I also think it's super valuable experience to understand how an office operates and also to be able to watch and learn before you are responsible for handling a policy role. Um, so I did that for about a year, and then mostly people promote as people in their office leave. So someone in my office left, and so I got to take the legislative correspondent position, and was actually helping on healthcare policy very early in my career. And I have zero background in healthcare, but these roles and the skills that you learn are very transferable. So after Doug Jones lost his reelection, I applied to another office for the next position, like the next step up, which is like a leg aide, just somewhere in between like a legislative correspondent and a legislative assistant. So I had more responsibilities on the energy and environment portfolio. And, the way I got that job, partially it's because of like the work that I had done in my previous office. When a member of Congress loses, everyone in that office loses their job. Like, you don't work for the state, you work for the member. So my bosses had seen my work and were really great about helping me find opportunities and advocating for me to other offices, because what you'll find is that many staffers have worked in multiple offices. So after some time, like, you'll be able to say like, oh, actually, I've worked with this person in the past, like they would be a great fit for our current office. And that helps with the interviewing process, just because it can be really competitive. I tell people all the time, like, if you don't hear back, it's not because you weren't a qualified candidate, it's because they had so many qualified candidates. They really just were like, choosing gems out of gems. So after my time in Senator Stabenow's office, there are a lot of listservs that'll say like, these are certain openings in different offices. And so I saw the opening in Rep. Kuster's office and was definitely interested because of my connection to New Hampshire, and because of the portfolio that they were asking to lead on, which was the energy portfolio. And so I applied. And so typically, like, the ways that you move up in positions, I would say on the Hill, is either someone leaves in your office and you get promoted to that role, or you look for promotions in other offices. And what I tell people is just make sure that you're working for a member that you believe in and that you can back the priorities of. And I was really lucky to be able to find that in multiple members and to land in Annie Kuster's office. Does that help?
Yes, it does.
Okay.
I think one thing that is very true of DC, so a little bit of context, I interned at the Office of Management and Budget over the summer.
Great. Okay.
And so I'm like really fell in love with DC and now want to come back. And so I'm very interested in like the energy, climate, environmental policy space. But one thing that I think is very true is you don't know what you don't know.
Mhm.
And so it's just kind of trying to figure out like, okay, like how does some more of this work?
Yeah.
Whereas like talking to some of the other interns at like Georgetown, they just seemed to know everything that was going on already.
Yeah. And I would say like that's something that I think should be a better resource at Dartmouth. Like, you go to the Career Center, and I think Dartmouth does a really great job of helping students pursue certain careers, but I don't think that we've like built up a lot of the expertise sometimes in like the policy and politics space. And so that's why I think conversations like this are so valuable. But I will say, like, getting to the next step in like the interview realm on Capitol Hill is difficult. And I will always recommend people to start applying for internships, even if you've already like graduated as a student. Apply, get the internship for an office, and that way you're like here and you're working and you're developing those relationships, because people also hire people that have had Hill experience and who people that they trust can vouch for, because an early position might get 40 applications and they might all be qualified, or at least half of them are qualified, and an office has to do the really tough work of narrowing their decision of who they're even going to start to interview. Like, you can't interview 40 people for a position. So they may start to pick, resumes that stand out to them, but then they may also hear like, hey, this person entered in our office and they were fantastic. Like, you should really give them an interview. And that definitely happens. And, I think it makes it difficult to break through. But what I will say is that like the Dartmouth network on the Hill is really strong. And there are, I would say, at least a dozen Dartmouth alumni from the last 5 years that now work on the Hill. So leverage that. I would say go on LinkedIn, look up like careers that you want to have, or like look up Capitol Hill or the U.S. House of Representatives or the U.S. Senate, and look for people with Dartmouth connections, and message them. Because one of the things that I've loved about our alumni community is that people will always take the time to, offer their advice or their wisdom or their career experience. And we're always happy to do that. And then once you do apply for these jobs, like keep up your relationships with the alumni that you've reached out to. Like that's something I wish I would have done a lot better when I was a student. And I would say once you've reached out to them and then once you apply to offices, say, hey, like just wanted to let you know I've applied to this office. Like I'm hoping to hear back. And they might offer to flag your resume for you. They might say, like, hey, like, you and I had a great coffee conversation. I'm happy to tell the office that I think you'd be a good candidate for this. And I think those little touches actually do really start to move the needle.
Awesome. Thank you.
Absolutely.
That's great advice. That's great advice. And that's actually how we found Mia, right? We were looking through a database that we had, and it was really cumbersome. And then we just sort of started saying, okay, so we just need to find out who in Dartmouth, who has a Dartmouth connection. And we didn't know Mia before we reached out to her, and she was totally ready and willing to jump in and help with this session tonight. And so you're one great example, Mia, right, of the the power of the alumni network and the joy of giving back. So much appreciation there. Nina, should I pass the mic over to you? Do you have a question or a thought you wanted to share with Mia?
Yeah, so I'm actually a master's of energy engineering at Dartmouth. So I'm getting my master's
cool.
right now. And so I'm really interested in the energy transition. So yeah, I'm just right now I wanted to come to the talk because I'm looking for jobs right now, and I have been looking on like all different sides, like actually working at a developing company versus like analytics and government. So yeah, I don't have a specific question, but yeah, I appreciate the talk so far.
Yeah, no, and I think that's really cool experience. I've also seen people come to the Hill. It's a little less traditional and it may not happen as often, but I think is equally effective is, they go and work for another company or another think tank and they get really smart in this kind of policy or whatever policy that they're super interested in. And then they come to the Hill as like a lead on a legislative portfolio. So you're a legislative assistant instead of like, taking the time to maybe work up to that role. You come in maybe not with all of like the Capitol Hill know-how, which is valuable, but you come in with so much policy and expertise in a subject area that, members that really care about that are going to value that at the end of the day. So I definitely think there are opportunities to do it both ways, especially if you have a master's.
Great, thank you.
So can you talk a little bit, Mia, about what life is like, right? So I mean, what is your, daily, weekly, monthly life like? I mean, for those of us who were big aficionados of the West Wing, right? Life in Washington seems totally intense, right? And working, 17 hours a day, and just from your standpoint, what is it really like to work on Capitol Hill as a lifestyle choice?
Yeah. I think one of the running jokes here in DC is that, working in policy in DC is a lot more like Veep and a lot less like West Wing. I will say that our job works on a cycle, I think the same way like Dartmouth school year works on a cycle where it's like you have your predictable, like, during the fall, it's going to be homecoming. During the winter, it's winter carnival. It's like Green Key in the spring. Like you have your big events, then you have like your day to day, or then you have like your smaller cycles, which is like, your midterm cycles or like your 10-week cycles. So for us, like I would say our annual cycle is like, we know every year we're going to have to fund the government. There's going to be like an annual appropriation cycle. Like we're going to start submitting requests in January. We're going to be negotiating that in the summer and we'll hopefully get it passed in the fall or in the winter. And there are like certain bills that come up, every so many years. So it like there's some predictability, I would say, in the work. Like there's predictability in like the election cycle. There's predictability in some congressional districts because, they're very blue or very red. In the day-to-day, I'd say, most of my job is meeting with constituents and meeting with stakeholders that care about issues that my boss is working on. So she's on the Energy and Commerce Committee and works on the health, the telecommunications, and the energy subcommittees. So we tend to take more meetings in those spaces because people recognize that my boss has more ability to negotiate and pass legislation in those spaces. And like those are the things that she really cares about. So I'd say that, in an average day, I'd probably take two to three, and at busy time, maybe 4 to 5 meetings with different stakeholders. So, today I talked with a group that was really passionate about civic infrastructure and like building parks, or I talked to a group, I talked with my stakeholders who I've worked with, over the last 6 months on our national dam safety legislation. We're talking about more tweaks on the legislation. And, I also talked to adoption stakeholders today because we're working on legislation that will impact the adoption space. So again, we're talking about like, okay, what's our next step in this legislation? Like, who do we get to endorse our bill? What members can we get to co-sponsor our bill? So some of these are strategy sessions, and some of my other meetings are more like first time information gathering sessions. Some of the meetings will be from groups that are saying, hey, we really want you to support this bill. And then my job after, I've had those meetings is to research it. Like, who's leading this bill, who supports this bill, who opposes this bill. And then I make my recommendation to the Congresswoman. Like, I think you should support this for these reasons. This is why it makes sense for you, for your priorities, for New Hampshire and your constituents. So I really do work as an advisor, and that just means getting smart really quickly on issues. And then, throughout a week, I might have a hearing on one day. And so, like the telecommunications committee is having like a hearing on AI, and a number of committees are having hearings on AI. So AI and energy, how AI is going to impact technology, how AI is going to impact commerce. So I know that's not this week, but I'm going to have to prep for that for the next week. And so that means like having a lot of conversations with people who are smart on these issues, and their stakeholders, they're think tanks that, care really specifically about different parts of AI. Maybe they're super pro AI, or maybe they have like safety concerns about it. And it's really needling through all of this information to try and figure out what our priorities should be. And I think it's no different than if you're like writing a research paper. And so you're reading the work of like 5 to 10 other people, and then figuring out what your thesis is. Like, what is your point? Like, what do you believe in? What argument are you going to make based on what you've read? And that's what I do for the Congresswoman. I weed through all of the sources and then try and advise her on what I think the best argument is. And sometimes we'll have a back and forth on that, on, what I think might be the best path forward, and like why she thinks we should tweak that or take a different path forward. And it's being able to have those honest conversations, I think, takes up a lot of my day.
Hatley, you should go ahead and jump in if you have another question.
Okay. So another question I have is, how do you kind of maintain energy and excitement when the federal decision-making process is so long, and particularly at this point in time just feels so divided?
Yeah.
Especially kind of working in energy and environment, which is something that especially feels so divided, and just kind of like, how do you get through that? Just in terms of like not, or like trying to mitigate burnout or kind of keep a positive outlook.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think it's something that staffers think about and struggle with daily. Especially like the news is what our job is. Like, whatever is happening in the public space is what we are hearing about in our office. It's probably some of the issues that we're working on. I think right now with the conflict that's happening between Israel and Palestine, or between Israel and Hamas, has been a major issue that we've talked about in our offices. And, when I first came as an intern, immigration was a huge issue that we were talking about, that I think weighed heavily. When I was working in Senator Stabenow's office, like, we were trying to pass, this major infrastructure bill. We were trying to pass the IRA and get the Inflation Reduction Act passed. And these were like major climate and energy wins. And we were trying really hard to get funding in for solar and get funding in for EVs. And I remember in that office, we were like negotiating the EV tax credit, and we're like, $12,000 is what our line is. I think we finally got down to 7,500, which is tough, because it's like you have these lofty goals, and sometimes you do have to make compromises. And what I would say is, you need to continue to be believing in like the impact that you're making. Sometimes you're not going to move the needle as far as you would like, but I think the work that we do is still moving the needle. And that's, I think, what really keeps me going at the end of the day. I think before I came to Congress, I was a big like Green New Deal supporter, and that probably still is what aligns with like my personal politics at the end of the day. But I also work in these offices, and you start to understand what you can get done. And sometimes we're not going to be able to get our like big lofty goals done, but we can still get something really important done that's going to have an impact on people and change lives. And I think those little wins are what you need to focus on, because at the end of the day, they're not little wins. Like the IRA was not a little win. The infrastructure bill was not a little win. I think like we didn't get everything we were asking for, and that can be tough. But if you only focus on the parts that you didn't get, you're really going to overlook all of the changes that you actually are making with policy. And they aren't going to be as quick and as satisfying as we would like. And I think that's also why it's really important to figure out where you want to leverage and what kind of impact you want to make. Like if you want to make a daily impact, the federal government may not be the place to see it, but you're still doing the work that's going to lead up to it. And you just have to believe that every single day is adding up to that next big impact. Hey, Serena.
Hi, Mia. I'm so sorry I'm so late.
No, it's great to see you again.
Oh, good. Well, so you guys know each other. I was going to ask Serena if you wanted to introduce yourself and or to pose a question to make sure that we snuck your queries in before we wrap at the top of the hour.
Sure. Thank you so much. Yeah, you know me. I'm Serena. For anyone who doesn't know, I'm 24. I'm from Maryland. I use her pronouns. I guess the question I was going to reach out to you for was, in terms of, I know we've talked about this a little bit before, but in terms of kind of, the feelings of like the purpose of it, or like the presence, and sometimes it feels like the pressure to have a law degree with doing policy, in terms of like even like not just environmental policy, but like just regular like social policy, in terms of feeling like a law background is kind of like what necessitates or is what controls one's like ability to make kind of change in that. If you
Yeah.
could speak to that a little bit.
No, absolutely. I definitely think I felt the pressure to get a master's degree, or I'd always thought about law school. You don't need a law degree to work on policy. And I'm an example of that. I would say 80 to 90% of staffers on the Hill are an example of that. Before you go and decide to get another degree, I would highly encourage everyone to figure out what that degree can be used for and whether or not the career path you want to take actually does need it, because there is a lot of pressure to get your next degree and not just have your bachelor's and to remain competitive. And I think to some extent that may push people towards degrees that they might not have needed to get to the next step. Like I don't necessarily need a master's degree to do the work that I do. There's a lot of like learning on the job that I can do. And I don't need a law degree to work in legislative policy, because I'm not writing the policy. Like we have lawyers in Congress that do that work for you that are nonpartisan. I will encourage you though to reach out to people who have careers that you want, that you see yourself in, especially in the Dartmouth community. And the worst thing they can say is no, but I doubt most of them will. They may not respond to you the first time, or they may forget to get back to you. Bump it for them. Most alumni have very busy lives, but it doesn't mean that they don't want to have these conversations. I'm sure they're happy to. So leverage that. Like I would say LinkedIn's a really great resource to find people in career paths that you want to be in, even if they're not Dartmouth alumni. Message them and ask them what they did, or look through their profile. Do they actually have a law degree? Do they actually even have their master's? It might not be necessary, and you can have those conversations, and they might say, hey, actually having this would have like sped me up 10 years in my career path, so I recommend it. Or they might say like, yeah, I got it and it was a complete waste of time or money because I don't use it in my field. It would have been more useful for the field I thought I was going to go into, but I decided to change course. So don't necessarily feel like an extra degree is a barrier to the career that you want or the next step that you want. People will tell you very different things about the business degree or the law degree that they got, and it may not necessarily be needed unless they decide to like change focus. So find people who do what you want to do and ask them directly, because you'll get a lot more honest answers than the societal pressure to keep getting a degree.
What a wonderful question. Yeah, and what a wonderful response. I mean, I want to sort of probe that a little bit, because I think that one thing that we're seeing is that higher education is changing, right? with the advent of online certificates, online degrees, more modular approaches to education that are,
Yeah.
not just a sort of 2-year block of your life, right? And I wonder if you're seeing that in your compadres, right, in the space at the Hill, where it might be more, you might be able to be more nimble, right, in terms
Yeah.
of getting a smaller but more focused certification in a topic area or a skill set. And if that, I mean, do you see that as valuable currency for staffers on the Hill?
Yeah. And I should clarify, like saying maybe don't go and pursue a degree is not me endorsing to stop learning. Like I think those are very different. It's the same way where I tell people, I tell students who are like, I'm double or triple majoring, or I'm doing 2 majors and a minor. And I think, Serena, we've talked about this. Like
Definitely.
sometimes the actual major or the actual degree may not be as important as like the specific class in that major or the classes that you're taking, or not getting a full degree but getting a certificate in something very specific that's probably also a lot more manageable. I got a secondary certificate from Dartmouth after I graduated in data analytics because that was something I continued to want to pursue. And I've even heard from people who maybe got their business or law degree and maybe they don't use it, but it's changed the way they think and approach problems. And so I do think there's a lot of value in continuing to learn. I'll say as a Hill staffer, there are constantly opportunities from, public policy schools that reach out and like offer free like 6-month courses to staffers, like, specifically in environmental studies or specifically in like leadership management. And so there's so many opportunities to keep learning, but getting another degree is a huge time and financial commitment. And it's really important to like weigh the investment of that with like the opportunities it'll bring you in the future. And so figuring out what you want those opportunities to be should help you navigate whether it's a degree you need or it's a certificate, or whether it's more on the job training.
Last call for questions, Hatley, Serena, and Nina. I do have a closing question, if y'all are drawing a blank. Okay. Milla,
Mhm.
looking back on the time that you had working in the legislative space since graduation, can you pinpoint one of the decisions that you're most proud of and one of the decisions that you wish you had done differently, right, as a professional?
I can definitely pinpoint the one I wish I had done differently. And this was during my time as an intern. Everyone kept telling me, like, go take coffees with people, like, go talk to people and different staffers, go take coffees and like learn from them. And I thought I couldn't possibly have that much coffee and like meet with multiple people in a day. Coffees here don't mean actually getting coffee. Typically, they never involve coffee. They mean having a conversation with someone. And that's like those networking skills that you learn to build up. But for some reason, like networking still felt very unapproachable for me, or, it felt like I was asking too much. Um, don't be afraid to ask someone for their time. Ask kindly, ask respectfully. I would say when you send someone an email asking for their time, like don't make it more than 4 sentences. I think we have this inclination to try and over explain why we are worthy of their time. But chances are they prefer a short and concise message and will give you the 15 to 30 minutes to talk through their career. And I wish I had talked to more people sooner, because I think I would have figured out what I wanted to do in this career much sooner and how to navigate it much more effectively. So that's one thing I would definitely recommend someone, like, keep reaching out to people who are doing the work that you want to do. They're going to want to talk to you. You're only going to gain value from those relationships. Be respectful, keep in contact afterwards. Serena's done a great job of keeping in contact with me during her time as a student. And I'll say maybe I don't know if I can necessarily pinpoint, well, I'll say one moment where I think really helped to define my career on Capitol Hill was when I applied to Amy Kuster's office. And I think I was still, in a junior legislative position, and learning a lot in my office. And, it was great to have the mentorship. And I think I would have happily stayed in that role for over a year or another year. And when I saw the opening in this office, I thought, I don't know if I have enough experience for that. I don't know if I'm senior enough for that. Like, that's a lot of responsibility. I haven't been here long enough, and I almost didn't apply. And I think it's super important to continue to back yourself in your career decisions. And I think all of us deal with imposter syndrome to some extent. I think especially as women, we fear asking for too much or for over asserting ourselves. If it's not you, it will be someone else, like someone else with the same experience as you or less. The only difference between you two might be that they actually backed themselves and they said, I'm going to apply for this role. I'm going to see. The worst thing you can get is a rejection. No one loves it. You don't love not hearing back about a job. But on the other side of that is there are all the opportunities if you do nail that experience. So constantly like push yourself, I think, and value the experience and the learning that you've gotten through your career. It's okay to aim high. Like an office might say, hey, I actually don't think you're right for this role, but would you mind applying for this other one? And you kind of never know what those doors are unless you walk through them. Like, you know, we always worry about doors that are closed for us, but we don't talk about all the doors that we forget to walk through ourselves.
That is just a perfect response and a perfect way to close today. Mia, thank you so much for sharing with us your pathway, your experiences, your wisdom, and for helping us to shine a spotlight on what it's like to pursue and to excel in a government position focused on our energy and climate challenges. It's something that we know that there are a lot of Dartmouth students interested in, many more who are than are actually tonight at the end of week 8.
We've all been there.
And I appreciate being able to bring your voice back to that group of folks. So many appreciations. Hatley, Serena, and Nina, thank you very much for being here tonight. Be well. We'll stay in touch with you, Mia, and hopefully if Hatley or Serena or Nina have any questions, they can also reach out directly to you.
Yeah, please do. I'm pretty easy to find on LinkedIn, or feel free to email me or reach out directly. Always happy to help.
Terrific. And good luck with the dam safety legislation.
Thank you. Have a great night, everyone.
Take care. Thank you again. Bye-bye.